Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. So in this session we will be dealing with the Marxist school in Indian sociology, and particularly we will be focusing on the scholarship. One of the pioneering Marxist scholars of Indian sociology, A.R. Desai or Akshay Ramanlal Desai. So we will have a brief overview of what constitute the Marxist school in sociology, primarily through A.R. Desai's work. So before going into his writings and his ideas on Marxist sociology in India, we'll have a brief overview of the biographical details of A.R. Desai, because that gives a broad background to his writings and his ideas. So as you can see, we have a very old photo of A.R. Desai. He passed away in 1994. He was one of the pioneering set of sociologists in India, who was a contemporary of M.N. Srinivas, who we will deal in great detail in this course. So as you can see, he is one of the pioneers of introducing the Marxist approach to understand Indian sociology. So it is a very self-described framework that he adopted. His writings as fundamentally use the Marxist approach to understanding Indian society, and it is very notable that he is one of the early students of G.S. Gure, one of the pioneers of Indian sociology, and he did PhD with him at the University of Bombay. So he belongs to broadly the Bombay School of Sociology. So as a Marxist, his focus of his works has been nationalism. Is in one of his most important, his magnum opus was a sociological understanding of Indian nationalism. We will come briefly look at in the next slide. So he also looked at how the social configuration of Indian nationalism, and he also explored the various community development programs for economic development in village, how the planning economy has operationalized in the early decades of India. And he also looked at written on urban slums. He has a book called The Social Profile of Urban Slum, if I remember correctly, and also the demographic problems, peasant movement, So you can see the kind of areas that he has written as are broadly what usually Marxist framework will focus on, mostly on the economic, social, fundamental, material issues of the people. And apart from that, he was also served as a national fellow at the Indian Council of Social Science. He was also an institutional builder. He was a leader. He was in the leadership roles. He is an office bearer of the Indian Council for Social Science Research between 1981 and 85. And he was also the president of the Indian Sociological Society. So, Indian Sociological Society is the apex body of sociologists in India, the official body of the sociologists in India. And he served as the president during 1980 to 81. And the class that we will be dealing with today is a presidential address that he basically gave as the president of the Indian Sociological Society. We'll have a look at it in a moment. So just to look at the important works, his most important work is a book titled Social Background of Indian Nationalism, 1948. It was written at his early stage of his career and considered as one of the most pioneering body of work or scholarship that put lay down to the Marxist school in Indian sociology itself. So it is one of the earliest Marxist work on Indian sociology, Indian nationalism specifically. And he has also written on other books called Indian Path of Development, a Marxist approach, Agrarian Struggles in India after Independence, a Profile of Indian Slum, which was one of his later work, and the Changing Profile of Rural India and Human Rights of the Agrarian Poor. So he can see he was steadfastly adhered to this Marxist framework and basic material, economic and the basic social aspect of Indian population that remained his framework throughout his life. So in today's class, we'll be particularly discussing one of his most famous essay called, it is titled as The Relevance of the Marxist Approach to the Study of Indian Society. This essay was his presidential address delivered on the 15th All India Sociological Conference in 1981. So as I said before, he was a president of Indian Sociological Society in 1980 to 81, and on the conference of the ISS, Indian Sociological Society, called as the All India Sociological Conference, it held annually. He gave this a very important lecture which subsequently published as an article in Sociological Bulletin, which is a journal of Indian Sociological Society. So, we will be particularly focusing on this particular essay. Yeah, so he starts his discussion by looking at the importance of the juncture in which he was delivering this particular essay, which is on 1980s, right? So, what happens in 1980s globally and the national level? So, if you look at 1980s is also a period of great discontent towards the project of nation building in India itself. So, as India attained independence in 1947, the initial decades was more or less the decades of hope, right? He called it as a decades of hope because there was a lot of hope on the newly independent young nation, especially in terms of the path of development that is going to unleash in India, and which was morely within the framework of a planned economy, right? But what happens in the subsequent decades that India remains to be largely an underdeveloped, a largely poor nation, despite having certain achievements in some fields of education, science and so on. But India remains largely an underachieved nation to many people, to many commentators. And by 1980s, this disillusionment of towards the national project, be it in terms of political development, be it in terms of economical development, social development, because all these aspects that has considered fundamental drawbacks to Indian society, be it caste, communalism and corruption, all those things persisted even after 3-4 decades of Indian independence. And you have to remember that 1981 was soon after the period of emergency, which also considered as a great backlash to the most cherished Indian democracy. And the global scale, there was also a lot of changes happening, right? 1980s, the kind of world system that were formed after the Second World War, specifically in the bipolar world, in which one front was led by the capitalist idea led by the United States, and the socialist bloc led by the USSR, right? And you know how the world was divided, and in how India took a middle path and so on. But however, there was a lot of changes happening in the global scale as well, right? In the influence of socialism was waving down. The collapse of USSR was looming large, and as a lot of third world countries who was equally and more or less influenced by both bloc, especially the Soviet bloc, was also changing a lot of crisis in his policy, its economical development outlook and so on. So all these changes was happening, and this is in this context that he specifically delivering this lecture, and he says and asks this lot of global social transformation happening both at the global and national level. And he was asking this fundamental question, which we will see throughout this lecture, that whether the conventional or the traditional existing sociological framework that both sociologists in India and elsewhere have been using, whether such framework was successful in capturing this large, dynamic, fast transformation happening in the world society as well as the national society. So this is a fundamental question that you will see that he will deal with in the essay. And specifically, he was saying that one of the major changes that relevant to sociology discipline that's happening in Indian context is the massive growth of higher education in India in the form of large scale expansion of university and other specialized institutional complex, which he calls as a form of knowledge industry, right? So India was one of the most important social changes from 1950 to 1980s in India was a massive expansion of education, right? Though there are a lot of people who were not gaining literacy, but if you consider the absolute numbers, the kind of people who are coming into the knowledge economy, coming into literacy, coming into schools, colleges, and also specifically in social science institutions was in thousands and in lakhs. And I think that is a very important, and for Desai, that's a very important change, important aspect that is particularly significant to sociology in India. And he says this institutional framework, with the growth of education, with the growth of social science institutional network, amounts to a shape of a gigantic knowledge factory. which engage in large-scale manufacture of knowledge products comprised of micro-surveys and macro-field reports. So he was talking about how the emergence of social science institutions leads to a variety of production of social science knowledge, publication of various surveys, various macro surveys or ethnographic field reports, and he actually cites out several important works that is indicative of the growth of such production of knowledge, social science knowledge economy in the recent times, in his times in 1980s. But but even though there was a growth of the knowledge economy within social science, he finds that there's something basically disturbing about the enterprise of knowledge. He says the production and dissemination in social science during that period, the quality of the object behind, the function performed and interest served by the massive products turned out by social science knowledge industry exhibit very undesirable features. And he says this is not just his opinion. He also quote that there has been such a discourse of discontents towards the kind of social science knowledge products that have been produced, and he identified that several of the practitioners in the discipline have realized the need to examine the problems at a deeper level, right? So he says a lot of social science or sociologist practitioners ask this fundamental critical question whether the kind of materials and knowledge that has been produced in Indian social science, broadly social science institutional framework, and particularly in the sociological paradigm, whether they helps to grasp the real nature of the transformation that is being brought about the Indian society. And he posed this as the most important question. So he says that it is also felt necessary to examine whether the knowledge generated through the body of research, whether it helps to unravel objectively and precisely the impact of the transformation. So whether the sociological knowledge accurately captures the kind of the nature of the transformation that has been ongoing in Indian society, and secondly, whether the sociological knowledge accurately captures the implications of this transformation on various classes and various sections of Indian population. So at both these levels, both the sociology in India was successful despite the sudden or the gigantic growth of social science knowledge industry in India. So this is a fundamental question that he posed, and he says that very many sociologists, very important sociologists before him, in the recent times, in late 1970s and early 80s, has pointed out some major limitations of the knowledge generated in India, especially in the field of social science, and he kind of lists out too many of them. So I have put together some of the central limitations that people have identified with respect to social science knowledge in India. So we will just briefly go through each of them. So the first one is the theoretical models and conceptual frames of reference coveted up to now appear of doubtful validity. So the most important thing that the major theoretical framework and conceptual frames or references that has been used is now appear to have a doubtful validity, whether these concept, this framework accurately captures or helps to capture the realities of Indian social science, Indian realities of Indian society. So there has been a lot of questions on the accuracy and the utility of the framework that has been used. And secondly, several methods of research to comprehend social reality of India found inappropriate and doubtful value to unravel the true trend of transformation, which is a continuation of the first criticism, whether this social science framework helps to understand, whether this is appropriate to understand the Indian reality and the transformation in Indian society. And why? Because sociological teaching and research cast in colonial mold even after independence. You know how sociology as a discipline has a very tense to problematic origin, right, through colonialism in India, and we will deal particularly on a separate session on decolonial framework in sociology, which actually cast important questions about colonial underpinnings of sociology as a discipline, right. We will deal with in later classes, but that kind of questions has already been posed, whether sociological, because of the colonial hangover or colonial continued use of colonial framework in sociological teaching and research, the problem of inaccurate understanding of Indian society, or the failure to understand the social transformation in India continues to happen. That has been important criticism. And they also pointed out to the lack of awareness of Indian sociological tradition. It's a very important question that you will keep confronting as you study sociology in India, that whether there has been a true, whether there's a genuine, can we have a very genuine Indian form of sociological tradition. And the critic says that Indian sociologists until 1980s, you have to remember that all these kind of writings was happening in 1980s, so you have to think of that particular time period. So whether the sociological writings or sociological knowledge until 1980s, whether they were successful in carving out a truly Indian sociological tradition, or they were merely imitating the Western tradition. So that is another important question that has been posed as a limitation, right? And there's also a related criticism that sociology in India was torn from Indology and history, right? So sociology was torn away from Indology and history. So sociology has been forcefully moved away from the discipline of Indology, and history, it has not been historically contextualized sufficiently. It has not used Indological insights that pertaining to Indian society. It failed to build its own sociological traditions. So, and what happens as a result is that our sociology does not address itself to the living concerns of today and tomorrow, and it is not identifying critical problems, pose right questions, and devise appropriate procedures of investigation. So this seems a very serious problem here. It not only fails to have adequate, appropriate framework or theories to understand Indian society, it fails to ask the right questions, fails to have right appropriate methodology, and therefore fails to find any important policy or framework or important suggestions to address basic social problems in Indian society. So this is a very serious, there's a serious consensus among several of the practitioners. Desai says that the sociology in India is in acute crisis, fundamental crisis, both in terms of its method, both in terms of the questions that is asked, both also in terms of the framework, theoretical framework that it adopts. All of those continue to be insufficient, inappropriate, inadequate to understand the transformation in Indian society, and also the implications of this transformation in particular classes, sections, and sections of Indian population. So then Desai come back to this question. So having summarized the important limitations of sociology, which has been raised by sociologists even before him, he comes back to the question that what have led to such a state of affairs in sociology, right? You have to ask a very fundamental question, why Indian sociology is in crisis? And he concludes that it was the framing of the very approaches for teaching and research in sociology that contributed to the production of knowledge products described earlier, which is very insufficient to understand sociology. So for Desai, the problem lies in the very approaches that has been adopted for teaching and researching in sociology in India. And he says, what is the problem with such approaches? He says the Indian sociology were rooted in the dominant style of sociology, which is being overwhelmingly pursued in India based on specific paradigms that were dominant in the US and Europe. So he says the sociological framework approaches were rather mere limitations, so imitations of the sociological paradigms that were popular in US and Europe. What were they? They were primarily the conservative and liberal paradigm systematized by people like Talcott Pearson and Robert Merson in the USA, and parallelly crystallized by scholars like Radcliffe Brown and others in anthropology in the UK. So you know that people like M.N. Srinivas, who popularized sociology, was trained in the British social anthropology tradition, greatly influenced by Radcliffe Brown, and you will see the later criticism that how such a sociological knowledge transition from UK to India was mired with a lot of colonial assumptions and a lot of problems that fails to unearth some fundamental sociological characters of Indian society. So you will deal with those critics of sociology in India in the later classes, particularly in the decolonial critique. So, but Desai kind of presuppose that or kind of make the same criticism much earlier in 1980s itself. So for Desai, since the dominant sociological paradigms in India was highly influenced by the sociological traditions in the West, primarily in the US and the UK, which were largely liberal and conservatives, as a result, the sociological traditions in India has completely disregarded the Marxist approach to understand society, because all the major pioneers, including J.S. Kude, M.N. Srinivas, and all those institutional builders in India, in Indian sociology, was primarily non-Marxist. And not only they were non-Marxist, they also adopted an attitude where the potential of Marxist approach to understand the Indian reality was never fully realized. So that has been, and he says that potential to use Marxist approach has been bypassed, underrated, and sometimes and most often been dismissed prima facie by castigating it as a dogmatic, value-based, and therefore lacking objectivity and neutrality. So you know this very often criticism against Marxism as economic determinism. So Desai says, and such criticism has been used without having exploring the strength of the Marxist sociological framework. And he says this is the fundamental problem that looms Indian sociology. He says the bypassing of Marxist approach took the Indian sociologists further away from relevant sociological inquiries on very crucial issues which Indian society was experiencing, namely the question of immense poverty, growing inequality, and other aspects of its backwardness. So Desai says that despite all the social transformation, why do some basic material social problems continue to persist in India, such as poverty, gender and caste inequality, and other forms of regional linguistic backwardness? And he says all these non-Marxist sociological traditions which are dominant in India fail to understand this question because they did not consider using Marxist framework, and Marxism, as it is being focused on this fundamental question, will be very important to understand, to address the limitations of Indian sociological traditions. So we will go how Desai kind of having posed his criticism, having said how the existing sociological traditions have been failed. Now he will foreground the relevance of the Marxist approach in understanding Indian society. So firstly, on the first relevance or the most important relevance of Marxist approach, Desai argues that Marxist approach has the potential to ask the right questions, most important questions with regard to Indian society as existing and transforming. So if you don't ask the right questions, you won't get the right answers, right? So for Desai, Marxism helps to ask the most fundamental questions. So that and he says and once you ask the most relevant questions, it enables the researchers to conduct research in the right direction, enable one to formulate adequate hypothesis, assist one to evolve proper concept, adopt and combine appropriate research techniques, and can help you to locate the central tendencies of transformation with its major implications. So you will see that by thinking of right question, what Desai indicates that sociology in India has to ask the questions about the fundamental social problems which is related to the material lives of Indian people, such as problems of discrimination, problems of inequality, problems of poverty and backwardness, right? If you ask such fundamental questions, you will get fundamental answers, right answers. So that is the first relevance of Marxist approach. According to Desai, it helps the sociologists to ask the right kind of questions. Secondly, if you ask the right kind of questions, what happens that Marxist sociology will direct you to focus on the most basic and primary, and he says almost life-giving activity, which is a very important term, a life-giving activity carried on by human beings, such as the production through instruments of production to extract the fabricated products from the nature, so essential for the survival and persistence of human species. So for Desai, what is fundamental to human society is the reproduction to their own life, right? And if you to understand any problem of society, be it the question of religion, be it the question of family, be it the question of caste, you need to ask certain questions about how that society has been basically organized. And at the core of the social organization for any society, according to Desai, is a question of production, right? And how do production and subsistence, how do that society subsist, how do the society finds its subsistence, and how do it reproduce itself, what kind of social relations have been formed in terms of its organization of production. So if you ask that questions, that will give the sufficient background to understand the social problems in that society. So for him, Marxist approach will direct you to ask questions about what actually sustains human life, right? And he says Marx himself has formulated the basic significance of this activity in the following words. He quote very important quote from Marx that men can, so how do he, and the very famous quote by Marx says, how do man, and he mean man is a human being, distinguish other animals? It is through the arena of produce, right? So he says man, a human being, themselves begin to distinguish themselves from animals as soon as they begin to produce the means of subsistence. So this is the fundamental problem. So sociology, Marxist sociology will redirect your questions to questions of subsistence and production by extension. And the third important aspect, which is also part of the relevance, is that as a result, as you ask questions on subsistence and production, it will redirect the questions on what he terms as the property relations, right? So basically, you know, this Marxist classification of social relations. In each epoch, human beings or society has been classified into different classes: the bourgeois and the proletariat, the feudal lords and the serfs, and so on. There are a lot of intermediary class as well. And how do their class position is being determined, how their status, how their position in each class is determines? It depends on what you do. It's not what you think, right? So if in the Marxist approach, if I make my subsistence by selling my labor power, I am a worker, I am a laborer, or in Marxist terms, I am a proletariat, right? So such understanding of social organization is very important for Desai to understand the social problems. And he says that Marxist sociological view will foreground or bring the questions of property relation: who owns and who doesn't own, and how do those people who owns property make a profit out of it, and how do they exploit those people who doesn't own anything but can only live by selling the labor power and make subsistence. So how do different classes find the subsistence, and how do we understand the sociological problems and transformation happening in India in the broader context of this relations of property or property relations? So this is another important contribution or central tenet of Marxist sociology. And he says Marxist approach considered property relations as crucial because they shape the purpose, nature, control, direction and objectives underlying the production, right? So production, social production of subsistence is a fundamental tenet of Marxist sociology. If you are studying any social problem, if you are adopting a Marxist framework, you have to look at the forms of social organization of production to understand any social problems, be it religion, be it caste, be it gender, be it popular culture, be it education. So if you are looking any sociological aspect, you need to have a focus, a fundamental focus on property relations and social organizations of production. That's what Desai suggests. Yeah, so for Desai, if you adopt a Marxist approach, you will understand the type of property relations existed, and then you will understand the character of the state, right? Once you understand what kind of social relations has been formulated as a result of the property relations, you will understand the character of the state and what kind of social transformation that the Indian state aims to achieve, what kind of policies, what kind of legal normative notions it adopts, what kind of policies it formulated for the transformation of Indian society. So you will understand the class character of the state, and you will understand the class character of the state only if you adopt a Marxist approach and have an understanding of the property relations. So this is a major point for him. Yeah, now Desai turns attention to the question, that a problem that there is a deep prejudicial attitudes among scholars, primarily non-Marxist scholars, to Marxist approach. And he is one of the most common charges against Marxist approach. The most common prejudice against Marxist approach is that Marxism is a form of naive economic determinism, right? So, according to that, Marxists will only look at economic relation and then derive their understanding of political and social aspect of a society based on this economic understanding. And Desai says that is not right. Even Marx himself, even in his preliminary formulations, even in his early writings, he never tried to reduce everything to economic terms. On the other hand, for Marx, studying economic aspect, the questions of basic activities, namely that of activity of producing things for human survival, is a very necessary condition to understand any social problem, not a sufficient condition, right? So, according to the Marxist, so for Desai, Marxist schema is not a form of economic determinism. Rather, to look at basic economic activities is a necessary condition to understand social problem, not a sufficient condition. So, you cannot understand social problem without looking at economic problem, but nevertheless you can also understand social problem by only looking at economic problem. So, that is the major difference or major defense against the problem of economic determinism that Desai makes. And he says that Marx, instead of trying to derive everything from economic activity, he was rather attempting to uncover the interrelationship between this basic activity. So, he was trying to understand, Marx was basically trying to understand the relation between economic activity, which is activities of production, and non-economic activity, all other forms of social organization, right? How there's a relation? So, he never assume a very causal derivative relationship. Instead, he tries to understand that very independently, sometimes very relatively, depends on the context. But he says, if one needs to understand a social problem, one need to look at the problem in the broader context of totality of social relations, both economic and non-economic social relations. You cannot understand them as isolated, as independent from each other. That's what Marx says. So, for Desai, property relations which shape the vital activity needed for very survival, persistence and development of human species should be viewed as an axial for understanding any society and the changes takes place within it. So, this is an axial of understanding it. So, you need to have that understanding to understand any other forms of social changes. It is not sufficient, right? It is not a derivative or deterministic relation from economic and non-economic. And he says, and Marx also suggests that any subformations within society need to be understood in a broader historical context as well, on the historical level of means of production and the nature of property relations. So, both the historical evolution of the means of production and the nature of property relations is a very important framework for Marxism, and any social problems need to be contextualized within this. So, this is the basic defense or basic point that Desai makes against the charge of Marxism as being equated to naive economic determinism. So, next he makes a very important point. I think this is one of the fundamental aspect of the Marxist approach that Desai outlines. He says, unlike any other theory, framework or approaches within social sciences or sociology, Marxist approach does not see sociology as a discipline, as a very autonomous discipline. It never sees, and because as we know, the various disciplines in sociology, that anthropology, history, political science, sociology, deals with different aspects of society, right? But how does a society operate? Society never operates in a very differentiated manner, and for example, the question of state that political science traditionally is preoccupied with, or the question of civil society or social broad society that sociology is occupied with, or the question of economic activities which economics is occupied with, all of them doesn't operate in a very isolated manner, right? How enmeshed the state in Indian societies, it can, or how closely linked our social aspect, social relations, familiar relations, and economic activities are. So following this greater intermingling or this non-existence of a boundaries between social and economical and political. So following that Marxist approach also tries to see social science in a very comprehensive view. It doesn't seems to make this bifurcation within disciplinary subjects in a very demarcated thick manner, but on the other hand it always has a tendency to blur them, to see to blur the distinctions between various disciplines in sociology. And it also does not study various aspects of specific social formation, tone of the social context. So you cannot, as I was repeating, and this is a very central aspect of the Marxist sociology, you cannot understand a social problem in an isolated way from the total context in which it operates, right? If you are to understand the problem of divorce in Indian society or a particular society, you have to understand how does the property relations, the social relations, the forms of hierarchy, social organization in that society. Only then you will understand a very specific problem as the problem of divorce or problem of child marriage, for example. How will you understand, or child labor, or problem of any other problem of communalism, for instance. In the Marxist approach, you will never understand how do communal feelings or mobilizations or growth in a particular context without understanding the social organization of that particular context. So you will never see that as isolated from the total context. So he says further, in the Marxist approach, history is a shank of all well-conducted studies of man and society. Shank is something that binds together. It is the central part. So history has a very central role in the Marxist understanding or Marxist approach. So therefore, with this centrality of history, a Marxist approach to society, which is Marxist sociology, will never see any society as a very isolated, natural, non-dynamic object. Rather, Marxism will see any society as something continuously on the move, because it will see it as being historically changing, right? So he says the Marxist approach also demands a specific society. Let's take Indian society, for instance, should be studied as a historically changing system comprised of contradictory forces, some of which sustain and others which change that society. So very important, right? So if you are approaching a Marxist approach to Indian society, you will not see Indian society as something that came to being only with the emergence of Indian independence. You will see, to understand Indian society, you will have to have a very long-term view, how society in India emerged over the years, right? You look at how the productive relations have been emerged, how different classes have been emerged, how different political forces have been emerged in Indian society, right from, let's say, a very prehistoric times, and how there has been a movement of people, movement of ideas, movement of productive relations, movement of technologies over the years, and then you will understand the present society as part of a long chain of development dynamics, and you will understand there are different forces at play. A society is not something carries similar kinds of people, right? It has different forces, and some forces will be at conflict, some will be at cooperation, right? So it has different people, and there are different forces. Some are contradictory, some are conflicting, some are cooperating, and some forces or the conflict between some forces will change the society. So society as you conceive today will not be the same society as you see 10 years down the line. How? Because the social forces comes into conflict, comes into contact, and change some fundamental part of the society. So you will always see society as movement within history, and this is a very important insight within the Marxist sociology. Yeah, so any Marxist approach to sociology will then endeavors to locate within specific society the forces which preserves and forces which prompt it to change. So here there will be two kinds of forces broadly. One that kind to reproduce the same kind of society. It does not want the social organization in a particular moment to change, For example, like take caste for instance. So there are four social forces in India which does not want the caste system to change. It needs that hierarchical social organizations. And then there are other social forces in India which actually seeks to transform caste as a system, right? It needs to annihilate caste, it needs to change caste. So there are different forces pertaining to change and continuity, right? So as Marxists, you need to identify such different social forces on any specific aspect of society, and then only then you will understand how the society is changing. So Marxism, the central focus of Marxist sociology will be the change in any given society. Yeah, so now let us summarize today's discussion. So basically, we have started with a brief discussion of A.R. Desai's ideas about limitations of sociological knowledge systems, knowledge production in India, and he laid out several limitations of sociology in India that has been identified by people before him, and then he kind of argues that such limitations continues to happen in Indian sociology because the sociology in India has been dominated by certain non-Marxist paradigms such as the structural functionalism and other conservative and liberal tradition within UK and US, and how such non-Marxist school has continually dismissed the Marxist insights of sociology. And he says how for grounding a Marxist understanding of society kind of address some of the fundamental problems, some of the limitations of Indian sociology. And for him, to advance an Marxist approach on sociology is nothing but give central importance to property structure, property relations in any society, right? It provides historical location or specification of social phenomenon. So if you have a Marxist approach, you will not see anything in abstract, but you will be able to locate any social problem, any social phenomena in a very specific historical and social location, right? And then he says, Marxist approach, then you will provide a matrix of concrete studies and concept to understand a particular phenomena in a specific type of society, right? And most importantly, Marxist sociology or Marxist approach to Indian society will helps you to locate the different social forces at play, both that works for historical continuity and that works against historical continuity and seeks social changes, transition, and eventually lead to transition from one socio-economic formation to another. And in that way, it will help to accurately capture the social transformation happening in Indian society. And he says a very important point to summarize that, by and large, modern sociology in India has completely ignored property relations, a central point or central object of Marxist sociology. He says the modern non-Marxist sociology has completely obliterated to the extent that it prides in appearing as a science of non-property aspect of social life. So there is this clearly distinction that let economics study all the property relations, all the aspect of the fundamental social organizations of human life, economic activity, and sociology be a complete a discipline that has been completely devoted to study non-economic aspect. And he questioned this fundamental bifurcation, and he then seeks to bring back the focus of basic economic and social activities, the basic aspect of property relation to the core, to the focus, or to the center of Indian sociology. And this is his fundamental tenet, fundamental argument of his envisioning of a Marxist sociology for Indian society. So I hope you got at least an outline and an idea of the central principle of what constitute a Marxist sociological approaches. So even though A.R. Desai was one of the pioneering Marxist sociologists, later on recent time there has been a plethora of sociologists who has been produced within the Marxist framework, and as you know, the kind of soon after he was writing in 1980s, and later in late 1980s, you must be familiar with the movement within Indian social science, the emergence of subaltern studies. Though it is it happens largely as a historical scholarship, it has contributed to some of the fundamental insights about Indian society from a broad Marxist school, at least in the initial period. And later you have people like Vivek Sibba, a more serious, a more committed, or someone who has been more affiliated with a very traditional Marxist view, who's contributed very important insights about Indian society from a Marxist point of view. So I think we will sum up today's class. Yeah, thank you.